Good evening. It's 9 o'clock. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. The King and Queen arrived in the United States just over an hour ago for a 4-day state visit marking the 250th anniversary of America's Declaration of Independence. The trip is one of the most important moments in royal diplomacy of recent years, coming as it does against a backdrop of strained transatlantic relations. Donald Trump has repeatedly insulted Keir Starmer in recent weeks, and Britain will be hoping soft power can help to smooth ties between the two nations. This state visit begins just 2 days after gunshots were fired at dinner attended by the US president, leading to heightened security concerns. The King and Queen touched down at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland at around 7:30 this evening, 2:30 in the afternoon local time. They were then welcomed by staff from the British Embassy and members of the US military before the national anthems of both nations played out. The national anthems of both nations there, and the King and Queen then left for the White House, where they're set to meet President Trump and the First Lady Melania for tea, which will be followed by a garden party. Well, our US correspondent David Blevins joins us from Washington. David, I mean, it's been an eventful 48 hours in Washington. We can get to the security concerns in a moment, but for the King, this is a high stakes and high opportunity trip.
Yes, Yalda, an eventful couple of days here in Washington, D.C., and we're about to have another eventful hour as the King and Queen arrive at the White House for an informal reception by the President and First Lady. The formal reception will take place tomorrow when King Charles will also address both houses of Congress here on Capitol Hill. He will also address a state banquet, and every single word is going to matter because we know the challenges that exist in terms of the diplomacy regarding the special relationship, or what has long been branded a special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, because it certainly is fractured right now. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, did a very good job of building on those relations when Donald Trump was re-elected to the White House. Who could forget the moment when he whisked that invitation from his pocket, inviting Donald Trump to take part in an unprecedented second state visit to the UK. That was regarded by many as a stroke of genius in terms of relationship building, and perhaps led to the UK securing the first trade deal with the United States at that time. Since then, it's gone terribly wrong in terms of Keir Starmer deciding that he was not going to involve the United Kingdom in Donald Trump's war with Iran, and we've heard the President be very critical about Starmer, suggesting he's no Winston Churchill, talking about how often the United Kingdom and other members of NATO have not been there in the course of the last 6 weeks that the war has been ongoing with Iran, and even going so far as to describe UK warships as toys. So the King is really going to have to exercise what is often described as soft power in order to try to rebuild that relationship over the course of the next 4 days. Charles, of course, has done that many times as heir to the throne, visiting the United States previously 19 times. But this will be his first visit as king, and it comes almost 20 years after the last British state visit when his mother was here back in 2007.
David, we're just looking at those images from a little earlier of their arrival, and we are expecting them to appear at the White House if everything is, on time in the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Yes, they were greeted as they stepped off the flight at Joint Base Andrews, just outside Washington, by Monica Crowley, Ambassador Monica Crowley, who is head of protocol at the White House, and by the British ambassador. They received some flowers from some children who, I understand, their parents work at the British Embassy here in DC. And after that brief meet and greet, they've embarked upon the short journey to the White House, where, as I say, they will, we understand, in the next few minutes be received by Donald Trump and his wife Melania in an informal way. They're going to have a little walk around the garden. They're going to hear about some beekeeping that is done at the White House. So a very informal event in many ways, leaving the tough part until tomorrow. The royal couple will be here for a total of 4 days, visiting Washington, D.C. They will also embark upon a visit to New York later in the week, where we believe the King will meet Mayor Mamdani. That will be interesting to hear what is said there. They're also going to visit Virginia, and then the King will return to the United States via Bermuda. But Yalda, there has been a lot of focus, you will appreciate, over the last 48 hours on security arrangements around this visit. The palace having reviewed all of the plans in light of what happened at the Washington Hilton Hotel at the White House Correspondents Association dinner last Saturday evening.
Yeah, absolutely. Donald Trump describing the King as brave for proceeding with his trip, and saying that, you know, all safety and security measures will be in place to ensure that his trip is a safe one.
Yes, a moment of wobble I think we had yesterday morning in the United States when Buckingham Palace made the unusual decision to announce that they were reviewing arrangements after the attempted assassination of the President of the United States on Saturday night. Donald Trump was very quick in a phone call to Fox News to say the King is still coming, because Donald Trump has been looking forward to this for quite some time. He's talked about the very good relationship he has with King Charles. In fact, he went so far at one point as to suggest that King Charles would have agreed to support the war with Iran if it was up to him and not to Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Far from reality, of course. But we know that the President of the United States enjoys the pomp and circumstance around royal visits. He talks often about how his late mother was a great fan of Queen Elizabeth, and we could see how much he enjoyed the visit to the United Kingdom when he was granted that unprecedented second state visit. But the President, of course, is also reflecting on the fact that there has been a third attempt on his life in those very dramatic circumstances on Saturday evening. Security around him is being reviewed, and security around this entire visit has been reviewed within the last hour. We've also heard from the Attorney General for the United States. He says that law enforcement didn't fail on Saturday night. They did exactly what they were trained to do when they apprehended an assailant who was on his way to the ballroom where the President was due to address members of the media.
Yeah, as you say, big questions are being asked at the moment about the Secret Service and what unfolded on Saturday night. David, as always, thank you so much for bringing us up to date. Well, as David was saying, this trip begins at a time when security is a concern in Washington. The man suspected of trying to storm the White House Correspondents' dinner with guns and knives on Saturday night has been charged with attempting to assassinate Donald Trump, giving an update on the investigation into Cole Allen. The acting US Attorney General said violence should have no place in politics. Just have a listen.
I want to make this clear. This man was a floor above the ballroom, with hundreds of federal agents between him and the President of the United States. The Department of Justice approaches incidents like this with urgency and clarity of purpose. Violence has no place in civic life. It cannot and will not be used to disrupt democratic institutions or intimidate those who serve them, and it certainly cannot continue to be used against the President of the United States. We are investigating this matter fully. We will apply the law fairly, and we will ensure that accountability is swift and certain. The complaint lays out what I think is described as a manifesto, which is something that he allegedly sent to many folks, his family. That's what we have so far as his motivation. As the U.S. Attorney said a few minutes ago, what is clear from the complaint and from what we have so far is he was targeting President Trump. He described that in his manifesto. He was targeting administration officials. He described that. But as far as us understanding additional motivation, that's for the FBI and law enforcement.
That's the acting Attorney General there. Let's go straight to our US correspondent, James Matthews, who was in court for the suspect's first appearance and joins me live now. James, I mean, quite an extraordinary 48 hours, just speaking there to David about the king's arrival. But of course, this is all happening with this security threat in Washington on Saturday night at that dinner. Just talk us through what happened in court today.
Yeah, hi, Yalda. Well, we saw him for the first time since those images, the grainy video, that still picture of Cole Thomas Allen on the ground, on his chest, in handcuffs. Today, just before 2 o'clock in court number 7, he was led from cages behind the courthouse. There were 4 marshals around him. He wasn't in handcuffs. He's a tall man, kind of stooping above those marshals as he was led to his seat, where he sat beside 2 court-appointed lawyers, the marshals directly behind him and surrounding him. He was very polite, you know, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, Your Honour, no, Your Honour, when he communicated with the judge. He slouched rather, looked tired to me, you know, has a goatee beard. In his mugshot, he's smiling, but there was none of that today. Looked tired, albeit attentive. He cast his eyes around the packed public benches a couple of times without necessarily fixing anybody with his stare. He did appear attentive when he was shown, or his desk, his lawyers, were shown pictures of the weapons involved. He stared at those images for a few seconds. And of course, we heard, as he listened on, about the charges against him. 3 charges in total. The big one, of course, is count 1, an attempt to assassinate the President of the United States. He was told by the judge that could involve a maximum sentence of life in jail, a fine of up to $250,000, and he nodded, one nod, in acknowledgement of that when the judge told him.
Yeah, and James, I mean, you know, when you think about it, this is the 3rd attempt on Donald Trump's life over the course of the last couple of years. Yeah,
as he well acknowledged, and in fact he spoke about his behaviour, his response to the shooting on Saturday. In that regard, said that he had been there before, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but that prompted him just to delay his departure. He wanted to watch, he said in interview. It has to be a real concern. And of course, the debate ongoing right here, and we heard it in that Todd Blanche news conference, was about what happens next with regard to big events in Washington, specifically this dinner. He said the only place it can be held is the Washington Hilton, and it simply presents an unacceptable security risk in his view. So essentially Todd Blanche and the Trump administration at large are using this as something of an advert for the ballroom, the building, and use of it. But at the heart of it all right now is the investigation into this 3rd attempt and the man accused of perpetrating it. They will be looking at the evidence that can be gathered, not just from the hotel, but obviously from his home in California. We heard about the weapons that were used today, Yalda. They were a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, a 38 caliber semi-automatic pistol, 3 knives, and what was described as dangerous paraphernalia. So all of that will be sifted through, as will this writing, this manifesto, if we can call it that he had drawn up and sent to members of his family. Indeed, members of his family had contacted police. But in that, Cole Thomas Allen is said to have spoken of targeting the Trump administration, prioritising the highest ranking right down to the lowest.
James, as always, thank you so much, and we'll be speaking to you again a little later in the programme. Well, we're joined now by Matthew Balzan, a former US ambassador to the UK. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us here on the programme. We're just talking there about the security concerns right now that the president is facing, and big questions being asked about the Secret Service. But of course, our focus is also on the King's trip to the United States. I mean, obviously, he knows the US so well. He's been there 19 times. And you were ambassador when he made a royal visit in 2015. A very different backdrop then.
It was. Thank you for having me, Yalda. I was thinking back to that wonderful visit, and he visited my adopted home city of Louisville, Kentucky, for just an incredible, intense, and intensely sort of local to Kentucky and the stuff that we were dealing with. And he was Prince then, and an incredible listener and thinker, and got everyone engaged. And now he comes back, and the stakes, as your commentator, I think it was David, who said, certainly at a important, and the stakes are really high. So I'm very eager to see what he says in the formal moments, and as well as the informal.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, just reflecting on what things were like in terms of the special relationship 10, 11 years ago, back in 2015, it feels now like a different time. President Obama was the US president then. You were the ambassador here. Just talk us through how, the focus on the special relationship, the conversations around the special relationship was then.
Well, it certainly was a different time, and we can't go back, and we shouldn't go back. We need to move ahead. I think, when visits like this prompt discussions on shows like this and elsewhere about the special relationship, I, for one, do think it's special. Sometimes we get into sort of parsing, how special is it? Was it more special then or more special now? Although I think the more important word is relationship. And there is such a deep and strong one between our two countries. And sometimes diplomats, former diplomats like me, and others sort of lead to a false impression that somehow we do hard things together, fight wars, hot ones, cold ones, do trade deals, manage crises around the globe, that we do these hard things because we're friends. But I think the much more powerful truth runs the other way, that we are friends because we've done hard things together. And so there are hard things for our two countries to work through now. And that's where the friendship comes from, not the other way around.
Yeah, I'm going to keep you there, Ambassador, because I'm going to bring in Hillary Rosen, US.
Please call me Matthew.
That's all right. Okay, I'll call you Matthew. But I thought, given you're a former ambassador, but okay, fair enough. I'm going to bring in Hillary Rosen, US political strategist. Good to see you, Hillary. I mean, just listening there, I'll say Matthew.
Hi, Matthew.
To Matthew, about how relationships evolve, relationships change, and that is part of having a grown-up relationship. Actually, I'm now being told that we are now seeing the royal couple emerge, so I'm going to throw to my colleague, Alistair Bruce.
And on this beautiful sunlit afternoon, the King and Queen received by the President and the First Lady outside the south portico of the White House. And they'll stop for a moment for a photograph as the cars have pulled away and the Marine sentries salute for the arrival. At the start of this state visit to mark the 250th anniversary since the Declaration of Independence by the 13 colonies of the Americas from King George III, who was the king then, the present king's 5 great-grandfather. And once the photographs have been taken, the President and the First Lady will lead the King and Queen into the White House and take them up to the State floor, which is the floor above the one where they are currently standing, and they'll go into the green room, which was decorated by Jacqueline Kennedy when she was the First Lady. at the time of President Kennedy. For the King, plenty to talk about as they retire for that very English cup of tea in the United States at the start of this state visit by the King and Queen of the United Kingdom to the President and First Lady of the United States.
Alistair, thank you so much. I'm going to bring in Hillary Rosen, US political strategist. And Hillary, we've seen that moment now where they've entered the White House. And just picking up on what Matthew Barzan was saying there about how relationships evolve, how relationships change. But, you know, the king is going or has arrived now at a very different time.
It is a different time. I would say it's not so much. I think Matthew is right that essentially the relationship between governments is one of self-interest, that where they work together when they have to and find mutual opportunities, I think, around the world. But I do think there is something to how much Americans love the British people and really admire the British people. And you always hear stories about how people come, their accents, we love British accents. And so there is an emotional connection, I think, between the countries, between the people. And I don't think that should be lost. And I think that somebody who understands that really well is Donald Trump, because that's how he feels. And that's how he grew up with. He talks often about his mother's love of Queen Elizabeth. And so I think the context we have here, so different than previous visits. And Keir Starmer's gotten a lot wrong lately, but one thing he's gotten right is recognizing that the king is his chief diplomat, and that Donald Trump really likes and admires the king and admires the position of the monarchy, and sending the king and asking the king to do this with his own foreign secretary is really important. And I think that that's something that people underestimate, is how personal the relationship is between Donald Trump and the king. Maybe more personal for Donald Trump than it is for the king, but it matters to him.
Yeah, and you talk there about how the American people view the British people, but it's also how the Americans view the royal family. You know, they've always had a fascination with the entire royal family here.
Yeah, and it's because it's foreign to us, right? We don't really have that. And we've tried to manufacture it over our history, right? It started with idolizing George Washington, when people don't realize he could have made himself king and instead chose to make himself president, our very first president. And we did that with the Kennedy family, where we tried to make them have some royalty. And I think Donald Trump sees that and would like his family to be seen as sort of a royal family, and the heritage that he's brought now in his second term. I don't think he's quite achieved that yet. But there is this notion that Americans have sort of sought to find people to put up on platforms like that.
I'm going to bring Matthew Barzan back in. Matthew, again, just continuing that conversation around the special relationship and what it means. In many ways, I mean, when you look at Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, it felt like Ronald Reagan would lean in on Margaret Thatcher. George Bush needed Tony Blair. I guess the question is, the way that Donald Trump speaks about Sir Keir Starmer and the way that he, sort of references him, that's what's been extraordinary, actually, to see, and the way that that has unfolded.
Yes.
I mean, do you care to elaborate on that point?
Well, he has no problem being dismissive of it.
That is true. No, look, I'm not going to try to characterize motive. I mean, I think you said it well. I don't have much to add, although I agree with Hillary in my previous comments. I didn't mean to suggest it wasn't a special relation. I think it really is. And it certainly exists much broader and deeper than just who happens to be at, 10 Downing in 1600 Pennsylvania, right? It was 80 years ago today that Winston Churchill coined the phrase in a trip to America, 1946, Fulton, Missouri. And it became known as the Iron Curtain speech, because he used that very memorable phrase for what consolidated power looked like. But that's not what Churchill called his speech. He titled it Sinews of Peace. And the point he makes in the not very often quoted part of that speech is that it is sinews of peace stretching across the Atlantic, not only between officials, but between farmers, between these two great and very different democracies. So that's what I think we should not lose sight of. We have a head of government, a head of state. And I think Hillary's point, we have head of state and head of government in one person that we call president. You all, the UK has obviously a different system with a constitutional monarchy and a prime minister. And I think the only sort of subtle change to what Hillary's saying that I would propose is that, so we do as Americans project onto that building your viewers are looking at, onto the White House, something more, I think, than British citizens would project onto 10 Downing, right? We're doing the palace thing and the government thing at the same time. But I think it is to the office and not to the family. And that's what I think we have a wonderful Republican and Democratic tradition of, is not getting too caught up in the family part. It's the office. You're there for as long as you're there, and then you let someone else do it.
Yeah, and in terms of the special relationship, I guess people focus on the rhetoric coming out of the White House, but actually, geopolitically, the two nations are aligned. When it comes to intelligence, for example, they're aligned. When it comes to defense, they're aligned. So we don't tend to look at the more deeper aspects of the relationship. We just look at or focus on the words coming out of the White House at the moment.
But I think that's historical. And I think that that's been disrupted. I don't think we have seen a president to date that would be as anxious to disrupt the norm as Donald Trump is. And I think it is still, the jury is, as we say, is still out as to whether he really can fundamentally change that relationship from a geopolitical perspective, from a government resources perspective, whether he really will, punish NATO members, including the UK, for what he perceives as a betrayal on Iran. That the idea that a single U.S. president could take over and so change that geopolitical relationship is still something of wonder, I think, around the world and in America as well.
Yeah, I mean, even things like coming out of NATO, for example, it's not as easy as saying we're going to come out of NATO. There's a whole process that needs to play out. So again, I think it's, the fact is that we hear him say these things. And I guess it always goes back to Donald Trump on the thing about, whether we listen to what he says or do we look at what he actually does.
I do think that there is a significant number of people in the UK who listen to Donald Trump almost too much, right? They listen to his criticisms of Keir Starmer, his petty, personal attacks, and think, wow, that's really a terrible thing for a president to say. But yet they don't realize that he actually says that about almost everybody in the world and everybody in the US as well. That is how Donald Trump speaks. And in fact, it led to his popularity and may have led to his election, that he speaks more in line with how normal people actually think about, relationships and less about the diplomacy of government leaders. And I think that is very unnerving to this country.
So do you think from the perspective of this country then the relationship has become more fractured and strained?
I think there is an exaggeration to it because of President Trump's rhetoric. And I think that is something that, I'm sure King Charles is smart enough to recognize in his conversations with him. He may nudge him privately on a few things, and my suspicion is that Donald Trump will be extremely deferential to the king in those conversations. He will be reassuring to the king in those conversations because ultimately he understands that he's got to, live in a peaceful world. And so I think that people probably take him almost a little too seriously, which is, upsetting that a president can't be taken for the words he speaks. But I think that this is a president who, changes his mind a lot and changes his rhetoric a lot.
And I mean, I suppose if you were to be fair to Donald Trump, it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, Joe Biden sort of didn't necessarily... I remember interviewing, members of his cabinet, and they often said, America is back and we're going to be focused on our alliances. But in reality, were they as focused on the so-called special relationship as one, expected them to be, given what they were saying?
You could argue that Joe Biden wasn't at all, that, trade was a problem under the Biden administration, that the economic support for each other was diminished. And also you could just say that Joe Biden essentially wasn't really that interested in being the kind of diplomat in his later presidency that he might have been. Whereas Donald Trump kind of wants to run the world. He certainly wants to be involved in it, and he certainly wants to be respected in it. And so I think that you see sort of through various presidents, Barack Obama, Matthew knows well, he saw himself as a peacemaker and as someone who was kind of pushing the whole world a little bit forward, a little more fair as he saw it, a little more towards working people. And he saw that not just for the U.S., but for the rest of the world as well.
Hilary, I'm going to keep you there for the moment, and I'm going to bring in our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock, who is outside the British Embassy in Washington. Laura, you were just at the airport when the King and Queen arrived, and we just saw them in the last few moments arrive at the White House as well.
Yeah, that's right. The King and Queen having what's being described as an informal welcome by the President and First Lady at the White House. They're going to be taking tea there, then being given a tour of the gardens and the beehives. Now, anyone who knows the King will know he is himself a beekeeper, often comes on these sorts of visits armed with a jar of honey to exchange. So that will be something of interest to him. And then the day, which I would describe very much as an informal kind of relaxed welcome to this state visit. The day ends here at the British Embassy at the ambassador's residence just behind me, where some 600 guests are coming to an afternoon tea party celebrating the ties between Britain and the US. Guests from every single background, the arts, science, business, enterprise. And the King and Queen will be the guests of honour at that afternoon tea party. So I think what we've seen is a soft launch to what is actually quite a tricky and a significant and a challenging in many ways state visits. I've covered lots of these state visits since Charles became king, and they are in many ways very similar, but I don't think I've come across one as carefully controlled as this one. And I think you only need to look at the fact we've got a president in Donald Trump who loves the British monarchy but also loves to say his piece, and you can see some of the risks that I think the staff at the embassy here will have had to have been mitigating, or at least running through, game planning if you like. They just don't know sometimes what he will say. He is unpredictable, isn't he? And I think, the embassy will want to talk about this being an honouring of the 250th independence of America. That's a celebration of everything that links the two countries, the culture, the economy, the historic ties, the people-to-people relations between us. But I think, behind all that talk of this enduring friendship, which is the new phrase for the special relationship, I think we do have a very tricky political situation at the moment. And I think it will be the elephant in the room. And I think that's why it's been so carefully choreographed to try and minimise any opportunities the president might have to say something out of turn. Look, he's not going to want this to go wrong. Neither side do. But we know that he is unpredictable. He's volatile. And that is one of the real risks I think we'll see over the coming few days. What will Donald Trump say?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, it's been described as high risk, high stakes, but also high opportunity. And while this may feel like a soft launch, as you say, they will be there for the next 3 or 4 days with quite a jam-packed schedule.
Yes, it is. And I think compared to tomorrow, today is a much gentler welcome. Tomorrow, I think we'll see the full fanfare of the American welcome, this big ceremonial welcome taking place. The King and the President will then have that meeting in the Oval Office. We'll see photos of it, but crucially, there'll be no cameras recording any discussion between the two men. Read into that exactly what you will. The King then heading to Congress for a joint address there, the second monarch to do such after his mother, the late Queen, did in 1991. And I think that will be a very carefully written speech, a speech that will want to draw, upon the history of the two countries and what links us, and the good that the two countries have by looking at the historic past, because I think the challenges of the present are so pressing at the moment. And then in the evening, there'll be this all singing, all dancing state dinner being hosted by the president. I think security will be a big issue tomorrow as well, although all of those locations are already very secure locations. I think compared to other state visits, the security is an issue, and following Saturday's incident at that dinner with the president, it has been ramped up. They've been going through every single one of those engagements and double checking they're happy that the security is where it needs to be. I mean, the words from the embassy here last night to us are very much, keep calm, carry on, everything's in place, it's proceeding as planned. But I think as much as you can plan anything when it comes to Donald Trump, because, as I said, he is an unpredictable president.
Yeah, indeed. Laura, thank you so much for that update. Well, this is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, we'll hear from the Prime Minister about the state of the special relationship.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We're in an area that's just been reclaimed.
Mr. Zuma, Sky News.
People are directly protesting.
The whole neighborhood is rallied around her. that's been impenetrable to journalists over the last 2 years of war in Sudan.
I've been waiting for this for 2 years. It doesn't feel like a big homecoming.
It was never going to be pretty. War isn't pretty.
Well, as we've been saying, this trip comes at a time of frayed transatlantic ties, with Donald Trump repeatedly attacking Keir Starmer over recent weeks. In an interview for the Cathy Newman show, the Prime Minister was asked about the criticism levelled at him by the US President. Have a listen.
Let's just look at some of the things that Trump has said just in the last 6 weeks alone. He's repeatedly slagged you off. He's dismissed UK aircraft carriers as toys. He's threatened new tariffs. He's questioned Britain's sovereignty over the Falklands Islands. Is it time to stop pretending this man is an ally?
Well, I think it's important, just as you went through that list, to remind ourselves what that's all about. I took a very clear decision at the outbreak of the conflict in Iran that the UK would not be dragged into the conflict.
It was your Love Actually moment, wasn't it?
Well, I'm the British Prime Minister. I act in the British national interest. And it's not in our national interest to get dragged into that war.
The Prime Minister speaking there to Cathy Newman. Let's bring in Matthew Balzan, former US Ambassador to the UK. And I mean, Matthew, just listening there to the Prime Minister speaking to Cathy Newman about the sorts of things that Donald Trump has been saying about Keir Starmer and about Britain. I mean, just to pick up on her point, you know, we can talk about how special the relationship is and how special the friendship is, but frankly, that is the sort of thing that the US president is saying.
Sure. And I mean, the topic of Love Actually is now, I'm allowed to bring that up because that came up in the interview. American audiences were cheering for the Hugh Grant character when that film came out. Right, so that is about values. Nobody likes to be bullied, and no one likes, in a true relationship, you make requests of the other. You do not make demands. And that's how friendships work, and people overstep in personal relationships and governments all the time. The word that I think we should hold at the front of our minds during what are sure to be an intense and really important next few days is one of King Charles's favorite words, harmony. Right, he wrote a book by that title. And think about what harmony is. And in an earlier segment, we talked a lot about either people are aligned or they're unaligned, or something is strong or it's broken. And I don't think binaries help us here, because harmony is people singing different notes to the same song. Right? So we want difference. That's what makes a relationship interesting. And when we say things like there's no daylight between the US and the UK, which is an unfortunate diplomatic phrase, we are pretending that there's a kind of agreement that there never was. It's a ludicrous standard of agreement. There's nothing wrong with difference. In fact, difference is what makes relationships powerful and interesting. So as we think about harmony, let's avoid the two bad extremes, total chaos and everyone singing something different. No one wants that. But the other extreme is just as bad, which is everyone singing, chanting in unison, same note, same song, same time. That is creepy. That is not powerful.
Well, I mean, but when we think about sort of where the relationship was under Bush and Blair, for example, when the United States called on Britain, called on its allies to come and join them in the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan, you know, all of these nations, 49 nations, stepped up to assist and stand with the United States. This wasn't the case with the war in Iran, and there was massive pushback. That in itself tells you how much the nature of that relationship has frankly changed.
Yeah, and each one, I mean, I think Afghanistan and Iraq are quite different, and we group them together because they happened at the same time, but the arguments were for each were very different. And so, you know, it's unfortunate that a very good phrase, a coalition of the willing, was used in a previous administration to talk about a subset of the countries that wanted to join in the second Iraq war. But coalitions are sort of, by definition, the good ones of willing participants. And that's why you make requests of people who you've earned trust, respect, and understanding with. And trust, respect, and understanding are these things that we bemoan the low levels of, but you can't get those things by just saying, trust me or respect me. They're byproducts, not products. You have to get them by doing hard, difficult work together. And that's what I think these next 3 days are going to provide a really good opportunity for.
Hillary, you were wanting to...
Well, I just don't think that people understand Donald Trump well enough to know that for him, this is the fun part of being president. He loves this. That's why he's doing this, right? That's why he's bringing out the full military parade, you know, despite the fact that his children actually, nobody in the Trump family actually served in the military, you know, but unlike the King's family. He loves this part of being president. He loves being in center stage in the world. And I think that this notion that somehow all of these really difficult problems that the world is facing are going to be kind of discussed in detail and solved in this conversation with the king, just that's not who Donald Trump is. That's not how he works. He doesn't operate that way. He has people who present him with options. He chooses. Sometimes he changes his mind, as we've seen multiple times with the Iran war. But he's not really the kind of president who's going to sit down and hash through a problem. So I do think that people feel like there's tension happening here. But he's, I assure you, much more interested in having a few laughs with the king, who is also very funny and personable. And, you know, but the king understands his mission, right? So he is going to New York City to go to 9/11 War Memorial, I think not just to honor the people who died at the World Trade Center, but to remind the world and Americans and maybe Donald Trump, oh, actually, no, Britain has been a good ally in very crisis times to the U.S. That's why they're going. The White House didn't want him to go there. So the king has a mission, but Donald Trump has a different mission.
And talk us through that a little bit more, Hillary, because I think, as you say, people think that there are these tensions and perhaps they're going to be hashed out and discussed behind closed doors. It's foolish to think how Donald Trump may, you know, try and navigate the relationship, but how do you think it'll play out behind closed doors?
I think that if the king has an agenda, Donald Trump will listen. He will make his points, you know, I'm sure subtly, but thoughtfully. And Donald Trump will be accommodating. He's not going to embarrass the king. He wanted this visit. This visit feels good to him. He's doing it because he thinks it's cool to be somebody that the monarchy respects. That is something I think that maybe some other presidents didn't enjoy as much as he does. He does enjoy this pomp and circumstance of being president. And so I think the king instinctively probably understands that and gives him that, right? He gives him the chance to be a part of that conversation.
And, you know, I've spoken to people who have been in Donald Trump's company and say he can be incredibly funny and charming and gracious and sort of likes to bring people into the Oval Office and show them around and you know. And
he is. It's his favorite thing. He's going to love giving the king the tour of the ballroom he wants to build. He's going to love telling him how the White House was a terrible mess until he got there and he and Melania made it pretty again. I mean, that's who he is. He's a bit of a show-off, but because he loves it.
Hillary, we're going to keep you there, and Matthew will keep you there as well. I just want to remind you about the other big story in Washington today. The man suspected of trying to storm the White House Correspondents' Dinner with guns and knives on Saturday night has been charged with attempting to assassinate Donald Trump. The judge said during proceedings that if Cole Allen is found guilty, he would face a maximum sentence of life in prison. Earlier today, the president's press secretary blamed dangerous rhetoric for the shooting and called for national unity.
As President Trump said on Saturday night at this podium, we as Americans must recommit ourselves to resolving our differences peacefully and uniting around the shared values that make our country great. The deranged lies and smears against the president, his family, his supporters have led crazy people to believe crazy things, and they are inspired to commit violence because of those words. It has to stop.
Caroline Levitt there. Well, Donald Trump and his wife Melania are hosting tea for King Charles and Camilla. They're expected to depart the White House soon for a garden party at the UK ambassador's residence. That's ahead of a packed schedule tomorrow, including the King's speech to Congress. We're joined now by Charles Anson, who served as the press secretary for Queen Elizabeth II. Thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. You know, we've been talking a lot in the last hour or so about how risky this trip is for the King. The stakes are high, the opportunities are high. But just from your perspective, talk us through, the protocol behind planning a trip like this and how it comes about, the preparation until it's executed.
Well, the King, of course, has been to the United States and to Washington many times in the last 20 years, but this is his first time coming as King Charles for what is now a very important state visit at a time when there's a great deal of tension in the world. And I think it's a very good occasion for the leaders of both the United Kingdom and the United States to meet at this time. It's the timing is superb from that point of view in terms of establishing and renewing friendships and important conversations that take place on the special relationship, on our trade relationship, and on the very difficult political issues that the superpower and other major allies, such as the United Kingdom, depend a great deal upon.
Yeah, and Charles, of course, the King will not want to get dragged into the politics of the day, but what do you think will be some of the key messages that he will want to get across, whether that's the speech to Congress or in other places?
I think really the purpose of this visit, the first by the King as the King, there's many other visits that he's made in the last 20 years, but the most important thing is to refresh and renew and to consolidate the areas in which we have a close relationship, particularly our relationship on the sharing of intelligence in terms of our shared language, in terms of our shared connection and commitment to democracy. This is an important time when the superpower and its major allies need to work very closely together. So the timing of the visit is excellent.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Well, I'm going to bring back in Matthew Barzan and Hilary Rosen. And Hilary, just listening there, to someone who understands the ins and outs of how the royals operate, it'll also be in the subtlety of what the King says. He is quite subtle and he will send a message in a way that will be clear, but also very subtle about the nature of the relationship and the steps forward.
Yes, and one of the things that interests me about this visit is how different the UK press is versus the US press, right? Because the UK press is used to looking for the nuances of the King's words or even Donald Trump's words. What are the hidden meaning behind what is happening and what is said? Because the palace doesn't speak very much. The King doesn't speak very much to the press. But in the US, it's quite opposite, right? Donald Trump is super accessible to the press. And so I think you'll see Donald Trump may try and interpret some of those meetings, some of that conversation with the King to the US press because he knows that the King isn't going to do it. And so it will be, in essence, maybe Donald Trump's version of how those meetings go. And then the palace may be backgrounding them, in private to some of the UK media.
And Matthew, what are you hoping to see over the next few days as we see this trip unfold?
Lots of our discussion, and I thought Hillary's points were so powerful earlier about the importance of this soft power and the symbolism. I am really interested to see what King Charles says in front of the joint session of Congress. First time since his mother did it in 1991. That is a big deal, as Hillary knows. I mean, we don't do this very often as a country. And as he looks out, he'll see a bunch of Americans. As I look out, I think of how, and Saturday night, I think will prove a reminder of this, how, just because we have the words united in the titles of our two countries is no guarantee that we will remain united within them. And so I am really excited to see Democrats and Republicans and their guests who they invite into that chamber to listen to someone who may get us to think about harmony, as I talked about, in a new way, the power of difference, as long as we're singing the same song.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Hillary, I just want to bring you in on that point because, that is something that we seldom see now in quite a divided America.
True, and it's kind of a reminder for both America and the UK. The irony of the King of England speaking to the U.S. Congress about on the 250th anniversary of America's independence from the UK is quite fascinating. And people look at their history and think back to the time when King George actually sent soldiers to America to stop this from happening. Charles' diplomacy in that speech will be quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Hillary, Matthew, thank you both for joining us here for our special coverage of the King's arrival to the United States. I'm just going to leave you with these images from earlier of the King and Queen Camilla arriving at the White House to meet with US President Donald Trump and the First Lady Melania. And of course, we will be following the coverage over the next few days. Do stay with us on Sky News.